Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Aerospace Deterrence Forum series. We're really fortunate to have with us today my good friend and colleague, retired Air Force Lieutenant General Frank Klotz. Frank is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. Prior to RAND, he was the Undersecretary of Energy for Nuclear Security, where he was responsible for the operation and maintenance of the National Nuclear Security Administration. His background includes Rhodes Scholar, White House Fellow, Defense Attaché to Moscow, as well as becoming the first operational commander of Global Strike Command. So welcome, Frank, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start the session out by giving you the opportunity to make a few opening remarks on the New START agreement, Russia's nuclear deterrence posturing, and perhaps what your view are as today's top nuclear issues. So over to you, Frank.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, for that very kind and warm introduction. I'm, of course, honored and delighted to have been invited to participate in the Mitchell Institute Nuclear Deterrence Series and to join you and so many other dear friends and former colleagues in this discussion. I've been asked to speak on the findings of my report on the military case for extending the New START agreement, published earlier this year by the RAND Corporation, which, by the way, for those who want to delve deeper into the topic, is still available on RAND's publication website. Perhaps I should begin by explaining my reasons for writing this report in the first place. In the current debate over whether New START should or should not be extended, much of the discussion has focused on political and diplomatic issues, such as our overall relationship with Russia, international stability, non-proliferation, and the views of our closest allies and friends. It occurred to me, however, that one piece of the story that had not yet been adequately addressed in the public discourse was the military rationale for and the benefits of extending New START for an additional 5 years, and conversely, the consequences for the US military if New START is not extended. Now, when I wrote the report, it wasn't at all clear whether New START would ever be extended. As of today, it appears more likely that that will happen one way or the other. Under the terms of the treaty, all that's required to extend it is for both parties to decide to do so. The president can make that decision on behalf of the United States. Senate and ratification or congressional action are not required. The Russian procedure is a little more complicated, but I strongly suspect that whatever President Putin decides will ultimately come to pass. A month or so ago, press reports indicated that the US and Russia were close to an agreement on extending New START before the election. That obviously did not happen. It's possible that the Trump administration could still choose to pursue an extension before it leaves office on January 20th. Whether it does or does not, the Biden team has made it very clear that it is committed to extending New START. And there is, in fact, a brief window of opportunity for that to happen after the inauguration and before the treaty expires at midnight on February 5th. If, and I stress if, Moscow is still prepared to do so. In either case, it's important for national security professionals to be able to articulate their views on this matter, because you may very well be asked about it. So let me briefly touch upon the military case for extending the New START agreement, and then I'd be happy to discuss whatever you wish to pursue in the question and answer session. Now, since the 1960s, the US government has pursued two broad approaches to preventing nuclear aggression against the United States, its military forces, and its allies. The first, and certainly the most visible, and I might add the most expensive, has been to maintain nuclear deterrent forces capable of surviving a first strike and mounting a response that would impose intolerable costs on the aggressor. To that end, the current programs of record to modernize all three legs of the triad, as well as the nation's nuclear weapons enterprise and infrastructure. Programs begun, I might stress, in the Obama administration and continue through the Trump administration should, in my view, remain a priority in the Biden administration. The second and perhaps less understood and less appreciated approach to maintaining deterrence from nuclear and safety from nuclear attack has been to negotiate arms control treaties that mutually limit the number and in some cases the capabilities of both US and Russian nuclear forces. Since 1972, a total of 6 US-Russian nuclear arms control agreements have actually entered into force. The fundamental US objective in pursuing each of these agreements has been to enhance strategic stability, bolster deterrence, and avoid a costly arms race. Significantly, in every case, starting with the 1969 US Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, US military officers have been actively involved in the negotiations leading up to these agreements. Moreover, once signed, senior military leaders have strongly supported ratification and implementation of these nuclear arms control agreements. This has certainly been the case with New START. In the midst of the Senate debate over the treaty's ratification in 2010, the then Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, wasn't exaggerated when he reported that the New START treaty had the unanimous support of America's military leadership, to include the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of the service chiefs, and the commander of US Strategic Command. Now, the cynical might say that senior military leaders are going to hew closely to the administration's official line when testifying before Congress or making public statements. But I can attest from direct personal knowledge that the senior military commanders responsible for US nuclear forces did in fact support New START, both at its inception and today in private as well as in public statements. More recent statements by military leaders indicate that support for New START has remained strong. For example, in March 2017, the then commander of US Strategic Command, General John Hyten, stated in congressional testimony that bilateral, verifiable arms control agreements are essential to the US ability to provide an effective deterrent. Two years later, in February 2019, General Hyten reiterated that he was still a big supporter of the New START agreement. So it's worth asking, why have senior military leaders publicly endorsed New START? What benefits do they see in the treaty for the US military? Well, military commanders throughout history have always sought to gather as much information as possible about an adversary's capabilities and intentions. It's no surprise then that the benefit of New START most frequently cited by senior military leaders is the additional insight the treaty provides into the size, disposition, and operations of Russia's nuclear forces, beyond those provided by more traditional intelligence methods. Under the terms of the treaty, the US and the Russian sides are required to regularly disclose to each other the numbers, types, and locations of their respective intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and nuclear-equipped heavy bombers. Moreover, they must also officially notify each other whenever any one of these systems is moved, for example, between maintenance facilities and operational bases. As of this month, over 21,000 such notifications had been exchanged between the nuclear risk reduction centers located in Washington and Moscow since the treaty entered into force in 2011. The treaty also permits each side to conduct 18 intrusive on-site inspections each year to confirm the accuracy of this data. In the process of conducting these inspections, our inspectors get a close-up view of the other side's strategic nuclear forces, facilities, and people. As General Hyten explained early last year, while he was still US STRATCOM commander, We have very good intelligence capabilities, but there's really nothing that can replace the eyes on and hands-on ability to look at something. If New START were allowed to expire without replacement, these verifications and transparency measures would cease immediately, as was the case when START 1 expired without replacement in December 2009. A second major benefit of New START, cited by senior US military leaders, is the important role that arms control can and has played in constraining the numbers and, in certain cases, the capabilities of Russia's nuclear forces. The nuclear arms race between the superpowers during the Cold War was fueled in part by concern that the other side might achieve a technological breakthrough or build up its forces in such a way as to threaten the other side's ability to retaliate in response to nuclear aggression, thereby undermining a fundamental prerequisite of a stable mutual deterrent. Arms control was viewed by many strategists at the time, both civilian and military, as a means to prevent either side from achieving an overwhelming first strike by capping the overall number of deployed nuclear forces. Similarly, imposing constraints on Russia's nuclear force posture had the added benefit of reducing uncertainty and enhancing predictability about Russia's long-term capabilities and intentions. This understanding has allowed the US military to size and shape its own forces with greater confidence in the adequacy of its own investment plans, programs, and budgets. During the 2010 debate over the ratification of New START, the then commander of US Strategic Command, General Kevin Chilton, warned that the less certainty that the US had about Russian nuclear forces, the greater the chances that it would either underdevelop or overdevelop its own capabilities, possibly ending up with capabilities the US military really didn't need. Importantly, the size and scope of the US military's current program to modernize US nuclear delivery systems were conceived with New START limits very much in mind. The Air Force and the Navy plan to replace existing US nuclear delivery systems on a roughly one-for-one basis, and thus within New START's limits on deployed ballistic missiles and heavy bombers. If New START is allowed to lapse without replacement, it would mean an end to the constraints on the number of US and Russian ballistic missiles and heavy bombers, as well as the number of warheads loaded on them, which could have implications for the adequacy of the current modernization program, as well as the resources being allocated to them. It's by no means a foregone conclusion that the United States or Russia would, if New START lapses, embark upon a significant buildup of long-range nuclear forces. Rather, each country might calculate that currently existing and programmed forces are sufficient to provide deterrence and stability for both the near and longer term. Likewise, they might prefer to allocate resources that would be used for a nuclear buildup to improve conventional military capabilities and explore the potential of emerging technologies. However, from the US perspective, if Russia did decide to expand strategic nuclear force levels, the US would in all likelihood feel compelled to do likewise, regardless of whether or not it would lead to a fundamental shift in the strategic balance or undermine mutual deterrence. Maintaining parity or rough equivalence in the number of US and Russian nuclear forces has long been a fundamental objective of US nuclear weapons policy and arms control policy. This is clearly an outcome I think the US military would prefer to avoid. The current US nuclear modernization programs are costly enough. Increasing the number of US delivery systems and warheads in a new nuclear arms competition could wreak havoc upon the overall Defense Department budget, not to mention the federal budget, as a recent Congressional Budget Office report quite clearly spells out. One final point, because I note that I'm running out of time. U.S. senior military leaders have also expressed concern about the number of U.S. and Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons and the Russian development of novel or exotic nuclear delivery systems, those publicly touted by Russia's President Putin. U.S. leaders clearly believe that both will eventually need to be addressed in some form or fashion. That said, it is my understanding that they also believe there is merit in maintaining the existing mutual constraints on the more traditional long-range nuclear delivery systems, that is ICBMs, SLBMs, and nuclear-equipped heavy bombers, systems which can directly threaten the homelands of the two countries until these concerns can be dealt with. It's not, in the US military's view, at least as I understand it, an all or nothing or take it or leave it proposition. So given these considerations, the most prudent course of action from the US military perspective, I conclude, would be for the United States to take steps to extend New START before it expires in February. Doing so would ensure that Russia's nuclear forces covered by the treaty are constrained for another 5 years. Additionally, US military leaders would continue to have better insights into the disposition of those forces beyond those gained through more traditional intelligence collection and analysis. Finally, extending New START would also give us the time we need to pursue a new set of negotiations that address the US military's other concerns with Russia's other nuclear systems, as well as China's nuclear capabilities and intentions. So with that, Dave, I'll leave it to you for any questions that you may have or our participants may wish to raise.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. That's a very good set of insights. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of the areas that you mentioned. You just stated that, and you articulated in your paper that you believe we ought to extend the treaty and then use the extension to explore alternative treaties that expand the coverage of New START. In your view, what are the most critical areas that the current treaty does not cover and need to be addressed in a new version, if you will?
Well, that's an excellent question, but let me ask it slightly differently. The first question is, what are the critical areas that the treaty does cover? And as I think I laid out in my remarks, those are long-range delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and nuclear-equipped heavy bombers, which have been deployed on both sides in significant numbers, and a portion of those forces being on a state of high readiness, and targeted, presumably, in the event of deterrence fails, on each other's homelands. That's a very significant threat. And it is one, it's an existential threat to both countries. And it's one which we need to deal with, regardless of whatever else is going on in the world or what other capabilities we may have that the Russians are concerned about or that the Russians have that we are concerned about. Now, in terms of, I guess my objective would be to extend the core elements of New START into limitations on those particular systems and the verification regime that goes with that. Now, having said that, we are rightly so concerned about the disparity in the number of non-strategic weapons which we possess compared to what the Russians possess, despite the promises to reduce those to significantly lower numbers undertaken by President George H.W. Bush and President Gorbachev as part of the presidential nuclear initiatives in 1991. We need to deal with those. I am concerned, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this in more detail, about the Russians' development of systems that are not covered by long-range systems that are not covered by New START. That's also something that needs to be addressed. And then we have the whole question of China, which I assume we'll talk about at some point. I'm not sure, however, that our concerns with each and every one of those issues ought to be addressed under a single umbrella,
Right.
all-encompassing treaty. It is possible that we can have a treaty which deals with the traditional long-range systems and other types of agreements that deal with these other issues. Let's take a page from what President Reagan did in the 1980s. He made it, he was very insistent, or the Reagan administration was very insistent, that the negotiations with strategic long-range nuclear forces ought to be kept separate from the negotiations on intermediate range nuclear forces, ought to be kept secret from the negotiations on missile defense and space systems. There were separate delegations, there were separate ambassadors, they coordinated with each other, but they pursued each of those efforts as unique problems that had to be dealt with. I suggest that that may be an approach that we'd want to take with whatever arms control agreements come following. One final point, Dave, and I'm sorry to go on this. It's not necessary, in my view, that everything has to result in a legally binding, Senate ratified, Duma ratified arms control agreement. The early strategists of the nuclear age talked about arms control or controlling arms as something that could occur on a spectrum ranging from formal legally binding treaties to politically binding agreements, to norms of behavior and rules of the road, to parallel unilateral understandings. And we ought to explore each of these modalities and apply them in ways that make sense to the problem set that we're dealing with.
No, very good, Frank. I guess you pretty much answered my sort of follow-up question to that, and that was going to be if you had the ability to rewrite the New START treaty or create a new START, how would you approach it? It sounds pretty much like you want to stick to the fundamental issues that are already covered in START and deal with those in an appropriate way to put them to bed, and then not hang so many ornaments, if you will, on this Christmas tree that it expands well beyond the fundamental issues that need to be addressed. Is that an appropriate characterization of your position?
Absolutely. In fact, said probably better and more concisely than I did. Thanks.
No, a kind of a bit of a follow-up in a broader sense. How do you see the role of, and this kind of gets into China issue, how do you see the role of bilateral treaties like a New START or the now lapsed INF treaty in supporting U.S. military objectives?
Well, there are advantages to having agreements that are multilateral or trilateral in certain areas, if it is possible. We have, for instance, the Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban, which we've signed but have not ratified, are all multilateral treaties which have done a lot over the past several decades to tamp down the number of nuclear weapon states that have come into existence. You may recall during the John Kennedy, you may recall reading about the John F. Kennedy administration.
No, I was alive back then. I was a little younger, but yeah, I was around.
That's where we both, the prediction was there could be 20, 25, 30 nuclear weapon states, within the next several decades. Well, that didn't come to pass. And the reason it didn't come to pass is because of an extraordinary effort in the international community, led in large part by the United States as a superpower, to put in place treaties, protocols, agreements that tamp down any desire on the part of nations to develop a nuclear weapons capability. So there is an advantage in terms of multilateral agreements, but I think you have to approach, as we did in the military, you have to figure out what problem you're trying to solve, what is your objective, what are your resources for dealing with that, what's the state of the battlefield, as it were, and develop solutions which get you to your objective. In the case of, again, I'll go back to the original point. Our greatest concern is in my view, currently, is the existential threat which Russia poses with its nuclear capabilities, and we need to deal with that. And the best way to deal with that, for a host of historical and legal reasons, is a bilateral agreement with the Russians. But we also need to be concerned about China. We need to be concerned about other nations that might seek to develop nuclear weapons capabilities of their own, and that probably means dealing with it in a broader multilateral setting.
Very good. Now, could you comment on how will New START's extension or termination, how would either of those affect Russia's nuclear posturing, especially when it comes to the force composition of their nuclear triad, understanding that they have resource constraints too?
Yes, well, as you and as the other participants in this seminar know, the Russians have been pursuing a program to modernize their delivery systems, but also their nuclear weapons infrastructure and enterprise and production capability for some years. I've seen estimates that they're roughly 3/4 or 80% complete with what they plan to do. And I suspect, based upon my experiences as the defense attaché at the US Embassy in Moscow, which I admit are dated, but I suspect that once they have completed this modernization program, they would prefer to devote whatever funds they have available for their military to enhancing their conventional capability. The Russians have long struggled with how you develop a standing professional army military, how you pay for the training and exercises of the conventional forces that need to be done. And I would think they would not want to pour more money, having achieved what they believe is an adequate deterrent force, that they would want to pour more money into that. Their greatest concern, as you well know, and perhaps an explanation for why they're developing some of these novel or exotic delivery systems, is that the United States will continue to develop the capability through its strategic defenses or through its conventional prompt global strike capabilities to negate that deterrent. And so I think they will continue to invest in ways to ensure that they have a secure, survivable, retaliatory force for the deterrent provides. So a lot of it depends upon their perception of what we're doing and what we are in fact actually doing.
Right. Now, Russia's development of non-traditional nuclear delivery systems that fall outside the scope of a New START posits the question of how to regulate or counteract these type of systems. How do you see these novel nuclear delivery systems affecting our nuclear deterrence calculus?
Well, first of all, sort of set the table. There are 4 or 5 different systems which President Putin a year and a half ago publicly touted. One was a new heavy ICBM to replace the SS-18 called the Sarmat. The other was a hypersonic boost glide system called Avant-Garde. And then they've talked about a nuclear-powered torpedo, a nuclear-powered air-launched cruise missile, and a nuclear-capable air-launched ballistic missile. I might add that 2 of those systems are in fact covered under the terms of the New START Treaty. As an ICBM, the Sarmat would be covered, and the Russians have publicly agreed to that point. The Avant-Garde, the hypersonic glide vehicle, rides atop an ICBM. Therefore, it would be treated as a warhead on an ICBM, and therefore also subject to the New START limits, as well as the ability to inspect that. And the Russians have publicly agreed to that. So the question then becomes those other exotic systems, a nuclear long-range torpedo, a nuclear cruise missile, powered cruise missile, and an air-launched ballistic missile. As far as New START is concerned, or an extension of New START is concerned, those systems are not likely to be operational in any great number, if indeed the Russians ever decide to deploy them in any great number, before 2026, when even an extended New START would expire and need to be replaced. So I'm not sure how germane that particular topic is to whether or not New START should be extended. Then the next question becomes, will they be deployed with New START or without New START in numbers that are operationally significant from a U.S. Planning perspective? And that of course bears watching. My own sense is the reason the Russians developed these systems were they were concerned about our strategic defenses. They were concerned about our ability to attack their nuclear forces with the conventional hypersonic, very precise weapons, and therefore wanted to create systems which would guarantee that no matter what we did, they would be able to retaliate, and quite frankly, a very horrific, just mind-numbing sort of approach. So I think we need to look at it from the perspective of, what is their intention for deploying these systems? What sort of limits can be put on them? I, for one, would like to see them capped or even eliminated. But then the question becomes, what's our bargaining leverage in the event of an agreement to get them to do that? I suspect they will want us to put strategic missile defenses on the table, as well as some sort of limits on our conventional long-range strike capability. And then the question becomes, what are we willing to countenance as far as an agreement is concerned?
Thanks, Frank. Now, if New START is not extended, how will it affect U.S. Global Strike Command's force composition, and how will it compare to the other two legs of the triad?
Well, as I said I think in my remarks, it's not altogether clear or a foregone conclusion that if New START expires and there is no arms control agreement, that either Russia or the United States would decide that it was in their national security interest to increase the number of nuclear delivery systems or deployed weapons that they had in an unconstrained environment. But if they did, I think there would be great pressure upon the United States to match them roughly in terms of numbers. That would be, quite significant, as I indicated, for the U.S. defense budget, but it would also be quite significant for Air Force Global Strike Command. Consider what they're having to do now with the deployment of a new bomber, with the development and deployment of a new bomber, the development and deployment of a new intercontinental ballistic missile, the ground-based strategic deterrent system. All at the same time, they're having to maintain and operate and secure the legacy systems. All at the same time, they're having to support with the bomber forces geographic combatant commanders around the world. So, that's to add to that would be a very significant impact in terms of its ability to carry out its fundamental mission. I suppose buried in your question there is how would force structure change? Now, I have a purely personal viewpoint on this. I think it's one you share, is that if we're going to increase any one leg of the triad, it ought to be the bomber force, because they are as everyone knows, our bomber force has both a conventional, with the exception of the B-1s, have both a conventional and a nuclear capability and mission. So that makes them a very versatile system. So in my view, the SLBM and the ICBM ought to continue as sort of the core fundamental aspect of our nuclear deterrent, as augmented and in a very important way with the bomber force, but that bomber force also has enormous capability and immense value to the conduct of military operations across the globe at both the high end and the lower end of the spectrum of conflict.
Very good. And that's probably a good point to sort of segue away from Russia and talk about China a bit, where the bomber is extraordinarily versatile in the context of deterrence, both from a conventional and nuclear perspective as well. But the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China recently stated that China's aggressively expanding their nuclear forces. They're pushing to complete their nuclear triad. They want to double their nuclear warhead stockpile in the next 10 years or so. So in your opinion, what's the best way to deter or curtail Chinese investment in nuclear weapons programs, if in fact that's even possible?
Yeah. Well, of course, I think that is the key question in all of this discussion. So let me unpack your characterization of the remarks of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense regarding China a bit. My own view is there is reason for concern about Chinese nuclear force developments, but not for alarm or hysteria. The Chinese have been engaged in a steady development of their nuclear forces for many, many years. I think the assessment of most observers has been that they're not engaged in a crash program, but a long-term program that allows them to balance defense dollars spent on nuclear forces with the enormous investment they're making in other capabilities. You know, the unclassified numbers for how many nuclear weapons they have suggest that it's a fraction of what the United States and the Russians have. They do have the capability to deliver nuclear weapons to the U.S. homeland, so that of our friends and allies, which is extraordinarily worrisome. I'm not so much concerned about the fact they're developing a triad. Every member of the P5, other member of the P5, that is the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, have developed a triad, including the Brits and the French at one time in a fashion. So, you know, the diversification of your nuclear force to ensure its flexibility and its survivability is something that every nuclear weapon state has pursued, including, oh, by the way, we don't talk enough about these 2 countries, India and Pakistan, likewise are pursuing a triad of sorts. So, I mean, these are, again, these are issues that are worrisome, and we ought to continue to focus upon. But again, the level of threat does not yet rise to that posed by Russia's nuclear forces. And that's, again, where I think we ought to put our primary effort at the moment. Now, the Chinese have been very, very clear over the years in saying that they do not want to enter into arms control negotiations or discussions or on limitations with either the United States or with Russia, or in a trilateral setting with the United States and Russia. They claim that their force is a no first use force, that they will not use nuclear weapons unless nuclear weapons are used against them. But that, of course, is questionable considering the capabilities that they now have. They also claim that they will not engage in negotiations until such time as both the United States and Russia have significantly reduced their own nuclear forces. And finally, I think you'll find Chinese unofficial observers saying that secrecy is a very, very important aspect of maintaining the safety and security of their nuclear forces from preemptive attack by either the United States or Russia. Therefore, the types of openness and transparency that I discussed related to the New START treaty that exists between the United States and Russia would be an anathema to them. So I don't see bringing them to the table anytime soon to discuss limits on, constraints on, or reductions of their nuclear capabilities. And no amount of shouting at them through a bullhorn or trying to publicly shame them is going to bring them to the table. I mean, they view themselves as a major power, and they're not going to be bullied in that way. A couple months ago, my colleagues, Ambassador Bill Courtney and John Lauder, and I wrote a piece for Real Clear Defense, in which we argue the way to deal with the Chinese is to seek to engage them in discussions, probably bilateral discussions at first, but perhaps maybe in the context of the P5 on strategic stability. The Chinese have long resisted doing that at the official level. They've done it at the track 2 or unofficial level for quite some time, but indicated a couple months ago, the Foreign Ministry of China indicated they might be willing to start doing that. We should take yes for an answer and pursue that. The other thing that might be useful is to, again, in a multilateral context, a P5 or broader level, start to engage them in other types of confidence building measures, transparency measures. For instance, China has US and Russia have a missile launch notification protocol. I understand the Russians have one with the Chinese. That might be something you would want to expand as a 3-way agreement or maybe even a 5-way agreement with the P5. So there are ways in which I think they can be brought along, much the same way that you will recall the US and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. We developed other types of lower level or different types of agreements, the hotline agreement, a mutual unilateral moratorium on nuclear test until such time as the Threshold Test Ban Treaty was negotiated and ratified, incidents at sea agreements, which kind of built up a process of working with Soviet counterparts and then Russian counterparts on important military and strategic topics, and developing the modalities, and I dare say even the trust among negotiators in reaching agreements. So I think we need to work very, very hard on going down that road. I don't minimize the difficulties of doing that. We have very, very fundamental disagreements with China on its actions in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, on the theft of intellectual property, on a whole host of economic issues. But we had similar types of fundamental disagreements with the Soviet Union during the Cold War on its actions in Europe, its support of proxy wars across the globe. So it will be challenging, but I think it's a road we need to move out smartly on.
No, thanks, Frank. I think you're spot on in that regard. We're not going to get to a mutually accepted objective or end game if we don't talk. So speaking on these subjects with China at whatever level, if it's track 2 and that's the way to go, that certainly might produce desired results in both our perspectives at some point in the future. So it's certainly worthwhile to do. Well, listen, Frank, thanks very much for taking the time to share your insights with us today. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, we wish you and your family all the best in this era of ever-increasing challenges.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Frank, we're now going to open the session to questions from the audience who've been listening to the conversation. As a reminder to our listeners, you can participate in the Q&A by using the raise hand function. And when I call on you, please state your name and organization, and then you can go ahead and press on with your question. So let's get started, and we'll turn to Aaron Mehta. Aaron, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Dave. Hi, sir. Great to hear from you today. Wanted to talk about NNSA a little bit, which hasn't come up so far in the conversations very much. two questions. First, I'd love to get your take on the new warheads that have been ordered by the Trump administration, some through the Nuclear Posture Group, the W93, which has been discussed and has some early funding lined up for it. And then number two, just more broadly, there's a lot of talk in Congress right now about what the organization of the NNSA should be, the role of the Nuclear Weapons Council, and whether DoD should have more of an active hand in creating the NNSA's budget and designs. Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, likewise, Aaron, it's good to hear from you again. Please be assured, even in retirement, I follow your writing very, very closely. I
apologize.
On the first question on W93, I assume you're talking about W93. I know what I've read based on what you have written, what the NNSA has put out, and what the NNSA and the military have testified before Congress as part of the authorization and appropriations process. Although I don't have any deeper knowledge than that. Other than to say, I think at some point it is incumbent upon the NNSA, it's incumbent upon the United States to think about what it does after the current life extension programs get to a point where warheads again need to be life extended, and what makes the most sense in terms of developing capabilities for the long term. So I'll leave that at that. I will, however, take advantage of the opportunity to opine on the role of the National Nuclear Security Administration and where it fits or should fit in organizationally. Now, forgive me for building a little bit of a watch, but I think it's important to realize how we got where we are today. I think if you asked most Americans if the United States still has nuclear weapons, they would not know how to answer that question. It has not been a topic that is at the forefront of the public discourse at the moment. But even if you ask people who are knowledgeable about our nuclear capabilities and doctrine in a very general sense, who's responsible for the design, development, production, and cradle-to-grave maintenance of America's nuclear weapons, they would probably answer the military, the Air Force or the Navy or the Pentagon in general. Since 1946, 1947, that has not been the case. Those responsibilities have always been part of a civilian agency outside the Department of Defense, outside the military. That is a part of our political culture. And perhaps the reason why that was decided during the Truman administration no longer obtains, but it is still a part of our political culture. And I think it's one we need to accept. The placement of the NNSA inside the DOE, to me, continues to make sense for a couple of reasons. On the positive side, again, it fits in with our political culture, but also the NNSA is responsible for 3 nuclear weapons laboratories. But it makes use of all 17 national laboratories, the other 14 national laboratories, for which DOE has responsibility for. And the fact that they're in the same department allows a greater use of that extraordinarily important resource than would be the case if it wasn't part of DOE. The negative reason, or the obverse to the argument I just made, is I would fear what would happen to NNSA if it were placed in the DoD. And I say that as someone who had spent 39 years in uniform, not including 4 years as a cadet. And that is that I think it would very, very quickly, sink without a trace. Let's take, for example, other defense agencies like the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which does extraordinarily important work on behalf of the nation and on behalf of our security. Yet, as I recall, and perhaps it has changed in the time I've left the government, but as I recall, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency reports to an Assistant Secretary of Defense, who reports to an undersecretary of defense, who reports to a deputy secretary of defense, who reports to the secretary of defense. I think the opportunities for the director of the Defense Reduction Agency to have regular contact with either the Secretary of Defense or the Deputy Secretary of Defense is probably a lot less than what I and other administrators of the NNSA enjoyed with the Secretary of Energy or the Deputy Secretary of Energy. On any given day, I probably spoke with either or both of those individuals 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. And so the fact that you have that kind of access to a cabinet level official who can take the issues associated with the NNSA, whether they're policy or budgetary, to the National Security Council as a principal or as a deputy is extraordinarily important to the health of the overall nuclear weapons enterprise. So I think there is goodness in leaving the NNSA where it is. Now, as far as the Nuclear Weapons Council is concerned, I'm going to express a personal view. There have been different constructs of the Nuclear Weapons Council over the years. When I was in a couple iterations on the air staff and as a 1-star in the National Security Council staff, the Nuclear Weapons Council was a very small group of participants, generally at the level of principals. When I was the NNSA administrator, the Nuclear Weapons Council meetings had grown exponentially in terms of numbers of people who were in the room. And most of the focus was not on the nuclear weapons enterprise or the nuclear deterrent enterprise in general, but on what was NNSA doing. And there were 4 or 5 voting members who were from the Pentagon and 1 voting member who was from the NNSA and DOE. To me, that is just an invitation for the DoD to constantly grade the NNSA's homework without its homework being graded in a reciprocal sort of way. So if we're going to have a Nuclear Weapons Council, we need to have a Nuclear Weapons Council that is balanced in terms of responsibilities and in terms of representation, and takes a look at the entire nuclear weapons enterprise, not just that which is being done by the NNSA.
Okay, let's turn to Michael Gordon. Michael?
Hi, Frank. I just want to say that Rate My Room would give you a 10 out of 10 on that backdrop. My question is the following. It's an arms control question. In the Trump administration's dealings with the Russians, Vladimir Putin offered a 1-year freeze on all sides warheads. And this would be coupled with a 1-year New START extension. Presumably, if the Biden administration extends New START by 5 years, or perhaps the 1-year freeze, could be multiple years. But this was never worked out with the Trump people because it founded on the issue of verification, and Trump guys were pressing for portal monitoring and the like. My question for you is, do you think this is a good feature, freeze on all warheads, to graft onto some sort of stability regime coupled to New START extension in a Biden administration? And how would you make it work, since the Russians have made it clear they're not going to accept anything like portal monitoring at warhead production sites?
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's good to hear your voice. And in fact, practically everything I know about this topic is based on your excellent reporting and sources on this subject. I think the Biden administration is going to need to come to its own conclusion about what is necessary for it to agree to extension New START. Now, it has already said in the Democrat Party platform that it supports extension of New START. Follow-up interviews with individuals who will be most likely key players in the Biden administration's national security apparatus have indicated that's the case. And as you well know, there's only a couple of weeks once they are sworn in the inauguration to, in fact, make that extension happen. So I think what's probably most likely to happen, my own view would be that Russia has, in the past, I don't know what its current views are, you may know better than I, said that it is willing to extend New START without conditions. I think they had conditions previously. At this time last year, they had attached a couple of conditions to New START, and they've since dropped those. We ought to take yes for an answer. There's only 2 weeks to get this done, agree to extend the treaty, and then talking about, as I discussed earlier, those other issues which we are concerned about, whether it's the disparity in number of non-strategic nuclear weapons and weapons in reserve, or exotic systems as time goes forward.
But do you think a 1-year freeze is a good confidence building measure, and do you think it could be made to work without on the ground portal monitoring?
Well, I approach this from the, what objective are you trying to achieve? If the objective is to send some kind of signal that we're back to discussions with the Russians on these issues, I don't see any reason not to do that. But if your objective is actually to impose first of all, what do we anticipate that either side, either the U.S. or Russians, are planning on building up the number of nuclear weapons they have? I mean, the New START treaty already limits in fairly significant ways the number of weapons that can be deployed. I'm not sure what is gained by saying that neither side can develop more or deploy more nuclear weapons, which presumably be put in reserve since they can't be deployed. So again, I'm fairly agnostic, Michael, about whether or not that's anything that needs to be pursued at this particular state or not.
Okay.
All right, let's turn to Dan Mosqueda. Dan?
Good morning, sir. It's nice to see you. We, of course, worked together when we set up the first Air Expeditionary Helicopter Squadron out of 20th Air Force, and I was at Space Command. But so I have two questions. One is your view on the timeline for replacing Minuteman III with GBSD, and if you think it's realistic. And then the second would be, do you see the U.S. re-entering the Treaty on Open Skies, to provide, add to that transparency of military intent?
Okay, it's good to see you again, Dan, and those were important days. We set up the first Air Rescue Expeditionary Squadron support relief to Hurricane Katrina some years ago, very successfully, I might add, thanks to the skill of our helicopter folks. On the question of timeline for GBSD, my own view is replacing the Minuteman III. We're already late to need. I have had the opportunity since retiring from the Air Force to visit a couple of our nuclear weapons bases, and I must tell you that I was somewhat surprised and very concerned about the continued aging of our capabilities in the field. Not so much the missile itself or the warhead that goes on it, but as every missileer, and I know there's a lot of missileers on the net as we speak, a lot of what we have to do to have a successful missile force is to conduct maintenance, which requires handling equipment. It requires test sets, test kits. It requires cables, a whole series of seemingly mundane logistical kinds of things in order to continue to operate effectively. And that equipment, quite frankly, is getting very long in the tooth. And our Air Force missileer maintainers are doing Herculean efforts to continue to be able to operate with aging equipment. So it's time to replace that particular system. I know there's a little talk going around within the nuclear policy and arms control community about the possibility of extending the life of the Minuteman III yet again. I'm convinced, based on when we went through this discussion before, that the economics and the technical aspects of it just don't argue for doing that. It's time to bite the bullet and to finally stop admiring the problem and solving the problem in terms of an aging ICBM force, which I continue to believe is an essential portion of our nuclear deterrent. As I said earlier in my remarks, or in first answer to General Deptula's question, I see the SLBM and the ICBM as sort of the core aspects of our nuclear deterrent, with the bombers providing additional capability, but also carrying out a number of conventional operations as well. So I think we need to get on with it. Of course, it's now behind the veil of secrecy, so it's hard to follow, the engineering and manufacturing development process in any great detail. But from what I understand is going on, it's very impressive what the Air Force has instituted in terms of their approach to developing the system. The second question, you'll have to remind me, Dan.
Yeah, sir, it was whether or not you think we should, or do you see the next administration rejoining the Treaty on Open Skies?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on open skies. My view is we probably didn't get a lot out of it in terms of enhanced transparency for where we flew our airplanes. But it was extraordinarily important to our NATO allies, their ability to independently, verify in a more transparent way military balance of capabilities or disposition of capabilities in the European region. And so I don't think it cost us a lot. The objections to the treaty that were raised by both administrations over time were largely technical in nature. I think there was a way in which we probably could have continued to work away with that, at the same time allowing our NATO allies to have a important and independent sovereign role in the way in which they also participated in monitoring the disposition of military forces and capabilities in the European area.
Hey, Frank, thanks very much. We've come up to the 11 o'clock hour, but we've got one more raised hand. If you have minutes at
Sure.
time, can you take one more?
Absolutely. My time is your time, David.
All right, great. Well, let's turn to Dave Anhalt then. Dave?
Okay, thank you very much, and good to see you, General Klotz. And because of your association today with RAND Corporation, I'm sure you're aware of the heydays of RAND in the early nuclear deterrence business with Albert Olstetter, Bernard Brody, Herman Kahn, Andy Marshall, many others. Two questions pertaining to that type of legacy and its relevance for as a model for going forward. Number one is, who is doing that level of thinking where we have a community of people that are energized about these problems for maintaining deterrence, and in case we have to regain deterrence through the course of a conventional war, for instance, where Russia decides to escalate, to de-escalate, so that we understand what we need to do in terms of nuclear command and control and so forth. And if that's not being done somewhere like it was in the 50s and 60s, how do we regain our intellectual excellence to support the changes that will no doubt need to be addressed, as the Russians and Chinese continue to evolve their own nuclear posture and therefore the dynamics of our threat?
Well, David, you raise an extraordinarily important question, and I think it is fair to say and right to say that the sheer number of people who have developed expertise over years of education, training, work on these issues related to nuclear deterrence in general, and our relationship with Russia, China, and other, particularly Russia, has dwindled over a period of decades, well, since the end of the Cold War. And oh, by the way, the United States military and several of its NATO allies have been very, very engaged in combat operations in other parts of the world, and that has been a very, challenging and complex task to undertake, which has required almost singular focus on making sure that we do that right, whether it's in how we deploy our forces or how we actually operate those forces in conflict. So the numbers of people who are devoting attention to this has dropped up. I must tell you that I personally, again, I'm only an adjunct senior fellow at RAND, but I'm personally quite pleased and applaud the work that is going on with RAND and in other FFRDCs in the Washington area as well as the nation, as they begin to focus on nuclear issues again as a result of the continued the development of nuclear weapons in Russia, as well as in China and other nuclear weapon states. So I think that I've also seen it in the academic world as well. I have an opportunity to sit on a number of selection committees for people to get scholarships or to do fellowships within the government on national security issues. And the number of people who are interested both in the history of the nuclear problem as well as its future is growing in number, and there's a number of very, very talented people who are being drawn to that. So I'm less pessimistic than I was 10 years ago, and I think that we are getting back to a balance in terms of dealing with the nuclear issue as well as all the other conventional and new technology challenges that lie ahead.
Hey, Frank, let me jump in here too and help answer your question that David posed, and give a shout out to Peter Husey, who works here at the Mitchell Institute and runs the Nuclear Deterrence Series. And he has been actively engaged over the last 30 years in keeping, I should say, bringing together the group of key folks with insights on these issues and keeping a laser focus on the importance of nuclear deterrence and the importance of the modernization of our enterprise. Let me add one more question that was texted in. This is from Tom Cullen. General Klotz, do you foresee ICBM force structure remaining at 400 on alert and 450 siloed?
Well, Tom, that's not, again, it's good to hear from you, Tom. We spent a lot of time together in the missile business over the years. That's a very, very, very tough question. It's ultimately a political question. You're very well aware of the fact that there are ICBM bases in three different congressional jurisdictions, 5 different states, as well as those other areas like Utah, which support the ICBM, and those members of the Senate and Congress have come together in a caucus to deal with these issues. So there are a lot of political imperatives to keeping the force structure either at the level it is, or at the very least, making sure that the force structure is equally allocated and balanced among the 3 existing bases at which they're assigned. So I suspect that's going to be a challenge politically if anyone wanted to change for some reason the nature of that force structure. Having said that, so I think the ICBM is going to be around for a while, both for strategic reasons of deterrence, but also there's a strong political dynamic that is behind it.
Well, thanks again, General Klotz, very much for your time and extending it a bit so we could get to some of those additional questions. We've come to the end of this Nuclear Deterrence Forum. And to you and to our entire audience, from all of us here at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, have a great aerospace power kind of day.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's a pleasure.
All right, take care.